Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining today's webinar hosted by Figures HR and Assemble. The topic of today's conversation will be around the challenges of a global location-based pay strategy and strategies for building an equitable compensation program. We put together an extensive report that actually accompanies this webinar. So we encourage you to take a look at the white paper that will be attached as part of the webinar to dive deeper into any of the discussion points that we mentioned today. But with that, we'll kick off. I'm Zach Esserig. I lead the customer activation team at Assemble. And I'm joined by Virgil Renegard, who is the founder and CEO of Figures HR, and Lisa Wallace, who's the co-founder and co-CEO of Assemble. So thanks both for joining. Awesome. So with that, as a bit of context, the past few years have forced a lot of international organizations to start thinking and sort of rethinking different ways to approach location-based pay compensation. And this has really been driven by the idea of attracting and retaining talent requires a very kind of location-specific pay strategy and being transparent with employees around how they're approaching that pay philosophy. And so in this report, we basically analyzed over 48,000 data points from both the Figures HR side and the Assemble compensation band database to start to bring to life how different organizations are paying employees across geographies. And then we've also teed up some next steps and some actionable points in terms of what to do about this and how to bring these insights into your location pay strategy. So with that, I will kick it over to Lisa to walk us through one of the first big insights.
Yeah, so I think one of the most interesting things that we found that was surprising even to the Figures and the Assemble team was the large discrepancy between US companies and what they pay on average and similar sized countries in various countries in Europe. Similar sized companies of various countries in Europe. So just to rattle off a couple of statistics, we found that US companies paid in between 1.6x to 2x more than similar sized companies in Europe, with the largest gap being in France, actually, where the US pays around 2x more than the average company in France. And I'm curious, Virgil, given that you're a French citizen based in France, building your company there, kind of what your initial reaction to that finding was.
Wasn't overly surprised. I think something that's been consistent across the years is like when you look at Europe, well, of course, the gap to the US had been present across the year. We don't have the data to back this up, but I'd be curious to see if it increased over the last few years with the explosion of tech companies and so on. But it's always been in the sense that UK was the highest paying salaries in Europe. Then you had Germany, then you had France pretty much as a result line. And this is what our numbers showed. So no big surprise there, I'd say.
Yeah, so just to look at the Germany and UK data specifically, it looks like US salaries are 1.6x those of the UK. So still a huge gap, but not as large as the gap between US companies and French companies. And then Germany is about 1.8x those of US salaries. So right in the middle. Is that consistent with what you thought? And would you say that that is based on the kind of maturity of the tech sector in those respective countries?
I think it's tied to partly tied to, in fact, cost of living and maturity of the tech sector. Yes, when you look at that, once again, most mature market is the UK. Then you have Germany. Then you have France, with France catching up, in fact, fast in terms of maturity of the tech sector. When you look at funding, when you look at number of tech companies having even subsidiaries there and so on. But yeah, it's been quite consistent across the year, and it's a good reflection of the maturity of the market.
Yeah, you had a good point earlier, Virgil, too, about the difference between cost of market and cost of labor, or cost of living, cost of labor in Europe, because Berlin might even have a lower cost of living than Paris. Do you want to speak on that?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? We'll get at the end of the webinar on some of the suggestions and actionable insights that we can recommend to companies, right? But one key example of the difference between cost of living, which is how much does it cost to live in a place and like spending power and so on, and cost of labor, which is an approximation of an average of the salaries being paid for given roles in that market. Berlin versus Paris is interesting because, in fact, yes, Berlin on average is considered to have a lower cost of living than Paris, but salaries tends to be higher than Paris on average, right? So this is why we see that when we talk about defining compensation policy, and once again, we'll get back to that, cost of labor is the most interesting thing to have a look at. And the reason why there's this gap, once again, just talked about it, Berlin has been historically a much mature tech market and in which salaries have been increasing in decorrelation with cost of living.
Yeah, that's super, super fascinating. And then the last finding on just a company level view of comparison is that we actually saw the gap widen the larger the company. So looking at similar sized companies that are SMBs between the US and similar sized companies in Europe, and SMBs we define in this report as fewer than 50 employees, we actually saw that the wage gap was around 1.8x. So US companies paying about 1.8x more than European companies if an SMB. And then for companies that are over 50 employees, US companies are paying about 2x for European relative to European companies, which I thought was really interesting that the gap is actually widening the larger the company.
And I thought that was interesting as well when you merge all those factors, location and company size. It's like what European companies fear the most is those giant US companies, right? The whole Google, Meta, Netflix, Adobe, and the like, coming into Europe and paying US-based salaries is something any company in Europe can't compete with, right? Like, and it's interesting to see the gap is the biggest when you compare like European SMBs, seeing talents getting poached or getting approached by like large US companies is like the worst nightmare for any HR person in Europe, I'd say. And I think this gap differs as well, and which brings us to the next point. Per roles and per like job families and so on, right? What we see is that on some roles like product and engineering, the gap is maybe lower than when we looked at customer success and like support roles, where the gap was on average 2.5x differences between Europe and the US. So much bigger gap than when you looked at product and engineering. And once again, I think it ties us back to like the market dynamics, right? We have more and more product and engineering people in Europe that are getting paid like US salaries, or for who tends to bring up the market for those roles, product and engineering. Meanwhile, the number of US-based companies paying up European customer and support type of employees, US-based rates is much lower, right? There's not many reasons to pay customer success or customer support roles in Europe in a higher rate than the local rate and the local European rate, which is why the gap is much bigger. Meanwhile, product and engineering, because talent and they're used to more and more remote work in those roles, product and engineering roles, you have European talent that can get salaries that have been creeping up to get closer and closer to US-based roles as remote work has become more and more prevalent. I'm not sure if you agree with that.
Yeah, I think that's likely. I also kind of wonder if part of the reason why we see such a big discrepancy with customer success roles is that that's one of the first things that you might expand to Europe with if you're a US-based company, because you're doing either like a follow the sun support model or something like that, or if it's more driven by just cost of labor and market dynamics, like you mentioned.
I think both can come into play. But in fact, when we're talking about the prevalence of remote work, I think it's part of our next part, right?
Yeah. So this was another super interesting finding, which is basically that when we look at remote roles or roles that are held outside of major cities, it seems like US employees get a worse deal on a relative basis relative to their urban counterparts. And we don't see this discrepancy in Europe, despite the trend of remote work being kind of global and just as common between the US and European countries during and the aftermath of COVID. So just to look at the specific data here, one thing that was super interesting was that we actually don't see a really large discrepancy in France or in the UK between employees that are based in major cities like Paris and London and employees that are remote or based in rural areas. And in Germany, actually, this is so weird, we see an actual 6% uplift between employees that are based in Berlin and employees that are based outside of Berlin. So I thought that was really confusing. Meanwhile, in the US, there's a 22% discount if you're a remote employer or in a rural area relative to being in a major city. So I'm just curious, Virgil, what you think about those results.
Yeah, one of the things we discussed earlier on is like that 22% discount at first I was like, that's such a huge discount for differences within the same country. But then we kind of realize that when you compare the size of the US with the size of like France, it's so damn different. And the differences between states are more akin to the differences between countries in Europe. And then the gap between Paris and Lisbon may be closer than 25% if you look and compare France and Portugal, which could be a better comparison when looking at this discount and when looking at the US. So that my first point was, wow, the gap is huge, but then remembering that US is such a vast country that is probably akin to some of the changes we have in Europe between countries. And the second thing was interesting, what we've seen in the data, and where we have the most historical data is France. We've seen that gap shrunk, right? It used to be 2 years ago that the gap between Paris-based employees and like remote-based employees in France was around 12%. And now I think it's like close to 4 to 5% or something like that. So, and it's creeping down, right? It's like it's slowing, getting lower and lower because more and more companies are starting to, and we're going to rediscuss about that. I think at the end is like going from a location-based approach. So I'm paying Paris people different than I'm paying remote-based people or people outside of Paris, which I used to do when I was in HR. The norm was that you take salary range out of Paris, and for someone living or working anywhere else, it was like minus 15, sometimes minus 10%, right? But now the norm is moving towards a nationwide type of salary range, and people in France will be paid those ranges that might be aligned on Paris or as France as a whole. And I think this is a reflection of the data showing that, at least in our data set, is that this gap between like people based in Paris or people based in Berlin or people based in London and remote workers start to slowly shrink. But I think it's the case also in your data, right?
Yeah, so we are seeing a lot of compression, despite the fact that there is a big discrepancy. We're seeing the same compression in US roles that we're seeing in European roles, which is that basically secondary cities are starting to look more like San Francisco and New York. And then also remote workers in general are getting an uplift by the shift to remote work. It's just not as pronounced as maybe the lack of discrepancy that we see in European countries. Maybe something to mention though is that I love Virgil's point that the US is a giant country, because it really is on a relative basis when looking at these other countries. And the discrepancy of 22% seems really large, but it's still, rural employees are still on average making more than employees outside of the United States. So if you're a multinational company, you're probably still likely to be paying US employees in general more than employees in Europe, for better or for worse.
Yep.
Should we move
on?
move
to the transparency part, right? So what's interesting beyond looking at just like gap comparison between salaries and so on is like seeing the trend in pay transparency, which is a pretty hot and burning topic, at least interestingly enough in the US. And I think I'd let you talk a bit more about that. But from Europe, most people don't see it that much, right? Most people don't see it at a topic that's coming up and a very important topic, despite the regulatory framework and like environment changing, right? So you're going to talk about the changes in the US, but what's coming in Europe is going to be mirroring the US in terms of the law and regulation changes and forcing companies toward more pay transparency. And when we look at pay transparency, right, we ask all of our customers, so what level of transparency do they have when it comes to compensation, when they onboard figures, and we have like 1,000 plus customers now. And what's interesting is that we ask, how transparent are you about your compensation policy? Meaning, do you share your target positioning, where you want to be on the market and things like that? Do you share your salary ranges? Like, are you open with at least part of your salary ranges towards your employees? Or are you even transparent around individual salaries, right? Individual salaries is only, which is quite kind of large, 11% of the companies that answered our survey said they're transparent and individual salaries, right? Which is the case, by the way, that figures, meaning everyone can access everyone's salaries. But then when you look at transparency in compensation and transparency in salary ranges, number one country each time is the UK, right? Then it's followed by the rest of Europe, including France. But then the last country, the least transparent country in Europe is Germany. Germany seems to have a real lagging behind when it comes to being comfortable sharing more data around compensation. But once again, with the upcoming laws in the next few months and years that are coming in the European Union, I think they'll have to catch up to the UK, which on average, always in terms of maturity when it comes to HR and compensation, tends to be above the rest of mainland Europe. So I'm not surprised that UK, on average, UK-based companies are more transparent because on average, they are more structured and more mature, right? So I think they're a bit ahead of the rest of the companies. But yeah, I'll let you talk about pay transparency and the context you have, the burning context you have around the US.
Yeah, yeah. I liked your point about the maturity of UK companies on a relative basis, because that is it does make it a lot easier to be transparent if you have robust programming in place. In the United States, we of course saw a lot less transparency overall based on self-reported data. But I bet you that changes over the next 12 months. So basically what's happening in the United States is that there have been multiple states, including California and New York and Washington State, which are huge states with lots of industries, of all passed laws that require disclosure of pay ranges in job descriptions, and then also to current employees if they're within that role. And then there's some other reporting that's associated with it, but there's really been a strong influx of pay transparency legislation across different states, and some that hasn't been passed yet, but is in the process of being drafted, like in Massachusetts. So I'd anticipate that even if it wasn't sort of the norm, especially across the tech industry and biotech and healthcare industries, which tend to be centered in California and New York, even if it wasn't the norm to share pay ranges today, companies are going to be forced to, and it's really going to change the culture over the course of the next 12 months.
Yeah, which is interesting because I think one thing we discussed is that interesting effect on pay transparency is that it forces companies to get structured, right? Because pay transparency is going to push companies to shed a light on their compensation practices, at least the salary ranges. But I think what's interesting is what the EU was voted in 15th of December that most people don't know about yet, is that they're working on implementing within the next 3 years laws that will force the European Union members to report salary ranges on job ads, but also be forced to take meaningful action plans whenever they have a more than 5% pay gap between men and women within the same roles, and will force some kind of ability for employees to request information from their company on average and median salaries on their given role, meaning that any employee could be like, I want to know what's the average salary for my role within the company, right? So those laws are coming up and will force companies to get structured, because if you're forced to shed a light into your compensation practices, you don't want to have some skeletons in the closet hanging out in terms of unfairness compared to the market between people and so on, which I think kind of leads us to the next point, is like what companies can do to structure their compensation in a remote setting and in a context of pay transparency, pushing them to get structured sooner rather than later, right? So I think we've outlined 4 key actions. Based on that, I'll let you go over the first one.
Yeah. So just to kick it off, I mean, every company should have a compensation philosophy in place. It's kind of the North Star for how you should think about compensation, and should be consistent. The language should be consistent with the compensation programming that you put in place. And what really kind of helps with this is it helps managers and talent acquisition leaders and other people that are kind of in positions of leadership or decision making in some way with respect to compensation to be aligned and on the same page about what the compensation goals are. And it also helps explain the reasoning behind policies that are in place if an employee is only seeing part of the picture. So aligns your kind of managers and leadership around the core goals of your company and how compensation supports that and supports your talent strategy, and then helps be kind of the guide for explaining why compensation policies are the way that they are to employees.
Yeah, and I think it brings us the next point, which is once you've defined, and it needs to go in that order, right? To define your compensation policy and philosophy, because you can't get to the point, which is the point on data, before you've outlined what you want to do when it comes to compensation, right? You need to be intentional with what you want to do, when it comes to compensation, but then you need to apply it to the real world. And some people have been thinking that now in this new world with more and more remote work, you don't need to have like location-specific data sets. You don't necessarily need to know you're a US-based company, you're going to hire out of France or out of Portugal tomorrow. You're like, you know what? I'm just either start to apply a generic discount, or I'm going to have a look at cost of living estimates to help me send out offer in Portugal. That still can't work. It's very much still, on average, a location-based market. All those numbers that we shared earlier in the webinar show that still differences. It's still a local market, maybe not a local to the location, the city, maybe more and more of a national market, right? At least in Europe, not in the US, because we saw the differences between states, but in Europe, it's very much a country per country market. So you need to have relevant local data set, because if not, you're going to get challenged by candidates, you're going to get challenged by employees. But where do your data come from? And if you just said, oh, we use US-based data and apply the cost of living factor, that won't fly. Once again, you need to have reliable data, location per location, country per country. But I think once you have this data, you have your compensation philosophy. you can
Yeah.
start putting things into motion, and this is where you need to start to get equipped. Or I'll let you go over the next point, Lisa.
Yeah. I loved your comment though about location-based data sets, because I think the findings, particularly relative to various functions, underscores the need to have some sort of accurate data point that can reflect cost of labor. Like if you're an American company that's saying, oh, I could just do a cost of living adjustment really easily based on some publicly available data, you might not actually be as competitive as you think you are in a lot of these locations. And so, or any company that's approaching a multinational strategy. So even just in creating your comp philosophy, having something to look at there is super helpful. The other thing we'd say is just, using technology to maintain employee equity, and maintain that, or just have some like actual data to suggest that your compensation strategy is working like you think it is, right? So the ability to see churn rates or candidate acceptance rates across different pay bands or geos, that's a really good way to gauge whether your compensation strategy is working. But companies that don't leverage technology have a very difficult time pulling those numbers. And those are like the KPIs of whether your comp strategy is actually functional. Same thing with employee equity, right? So we're not necessarily saying that every employee in France should make the same as every employee in Montana in the United States should make the same as every employee in New York City. But you should have a sense that with respect to position and location, employees are paid equitably at your company, and that you have the appropriate documentation in place to justify why those pay decisions are different, if they are in fact different. And it just makes it easier to, monitor with your benchmarking information, regardless of wherever that comes from, and then also make pay decisions over time, especially those that are collaborative, right? So if you're making a pay decision for a new candidate or an existing employee, and there's, the hiring manager involved, the finance leader involved, et cetera, all of that is easier when it's done in a real-time kind of collaborative software program, as opposed to over Slack or email or anything like that.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. And in fact, I mean, of course, I can't, we're both kind of biased. And especially as like myself, I come to creating figure because after 11 years of HR, I wished I had a tool like Assemble and Figures to help me manage compensation. So of course, I can't disagree with the importance of getting structured, especially once again, it's going to lead to the next point, right? Once again, the context, and we've talked about the regulatory context, right? But more than that, and partly because of the regulatory context, more and more people are going to be talking about compensation. They're going to have expectations around compensation and being informed and being educated around compensation, right? So because law is going to push it, but then the law is going to force employers to start sharing salary ranges. It gets people talking about compensation. So companies, they have to start like creating culture around transparency on compensation. It can't be a black box anymore, and it won't fly in the future, in the coming years, if you still have compensation as a black box. We talked, so once you've gone through the necessary steps of structuring your compensation, being equipped with the proper tooling to manage it, then you need to start the processes of communicating it to probably manager to start with, employee afterwards, candidate afterwards. And the company, and in fact, there's still, I think, an opportunity for forward-thinking companies in that space to be proactive into communicating. I think once what we've seen in like one of our partners in Europe, OTA, has seen that companies displaying salary information on job ads have twice the amount of applicants that those that don't, right? So there's still a benefit for companies that are proactive about communicating to benefit from an employer branding perspective, get more applicants, and even on an employee side, right? Employer branding can benefit, but if you wait until you're forced by regulation to be proactive, to push communicating, you won't have any benefit. And in fact, you might have probably a malus because other companies will be seen as more progressive than you in that space. So once you've defined all the steps to structure compensation and equipped with the proper data and proper tooling, I think you need to start the progressive motion of starting communicating about it, right?
Yeah, we're already seeing that in California and Washington. As those laws get passed, there are a lot of businesses out there that procrastinated on having a plan for compliance, and they're in some pain right now. So I imagine everything will get worked out, but it's a lot different to be building a program in advance and be kind of from an employer brand perspective and everything being seen as a first mover than it is to struggle to try to figure out what the minimal compliance requirement is and try to meet that when you're out of compliance.
Can't agree more.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Virgil and Lisa, for leading us through this conversation and the insights. I also wanted to just quickly thank Rudolph Dutel, Sarah Lovelace, Mary Jant, and Alistair Fraser, who also contributed to the report. So we recommend that you all take a look at the white paper that we put together. And thank you all for joining the conversation today.
Cool.
Thanks.
Thanks, Virgil.
Thanks.